Section 24 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 7, Chapter 1. It was one of those gorgeous and enduring sunsets that seemed to linger as if they wished to celebrate the mid-period of the year. Perhaps the beautiful hour of impending twilight never exercises a more effective influence on the soul than when it descends on the aspect of some distant and splendid city. What a contrast between the serenity and repose of our own bosoms and the fierce passions and destructive cares girt in the walls of that multitude, whose domes and towers rise in purple lustre against the resplendent horizon! And yet the disturbing emotions of existence and the bitter inheritance of humanity should exercise but a modified sway, and entail but a light burden within the circle of the city into which the next scene of our history leads us. For it is the sacred city of study, of learning, and of faith, and the declining beam is resting on the dome of the Radcliffe, lingering on the towers of Christ Church and Magdalen, sanctifying the spires and pinnacles of holy St. Mary's. A young Oxonian, who had for some time been watching the city in the sunset from a rising ground in its vicinity, lost, as it would seem, in meditation, suddenly rose, and looking at his watch, as if remindful of some engagement, hastened his return at a rapid pace. He reached the High Street as the Blenheim light post coach dashed up to the Star Hotel with that brilliant precision which even the new generation can remember, and yet which already ranks among the traditions of English manners. A peculiar and most animating spectacle used to be the arrival of a first-rate light coach in a country town. The small machine, crowded with so many passengers, the foaming and curvetting leaders, the wheelers more steady and glossy as if they had not done their 10 miles in the hour, the triumphant bugle of the guard, and the haughty routine with which the driver, as he reached his goal, threw his whip to the obedient ostlers in attendance, and, not least, the staring crowd, a little awestruck, and looking for the moment at the lowest official of the stable with considerable respect, altogether made a picture which one recollects with cheerfulness, and misses now in many a dreary market town. Our Oxonian was a young man about the middle height, and naturally of a thoughtful expression and rather reserved mien. The general character of his countenance was, indeed, a little stern, but it broke into an almost bewitching smile, and a blush suffused his face as he sprang forward and welcomed an individual about the same age who had jumped off the Blenheim. 'Well, Coningsby!' he exclaimed, extending both his hands. 'By Jove, my dear Millbank, we have met at last,' said his friend. And here we must for a moment revert to what had occurred to Coningsby since he so suddenly quitted Paris at the beginning of the year. The wound he had received was deep to one unused to wounds. Yet, after all, none had outraged his feelings, no one had betrayed his hopes. He had loved one who had loved another. Misery, but scarcely humiliation. And yet 'tis a bitter pang under any circumstances to find another preferred to yourself. It is about the same blow as one would probably feel if falling from a balloon. Your Icarian flight melts into a grovelling existence scarcely superior to that of a sponge or a coral, or redeemed only from utter insensibility by your frank detestation of your rival. It is quite impossible to conceal that Coningsby had imbibed for Sidonia a certain degree of aversion, which in these days of exaggerated phrase might even be described as hatred. And Edith was so beautiful! And there had seemed between them a sympathy so native and spontaneous, creating at once the charm of intimacy without any of the disenchanting attributes that are occasionally its consequence. He would recall the tones of her voice, the expression of her soft dark eye, the airy spirit and frank graciousness, sometimes even the flattering blush, with which she had ever welcomed one of whom she had heard so long and so kindly. It seemed, to use a sweet and homely phrase, that they were made for each other. The circumstances of their mutual destinies might have combined into one enchanting fate. And yet, Had she accorded him that peerless boon, her heart, with what aspect was he to communicate this consummation of all his hopes to his grandfather, ask Lord Monmouth for his blessing and the gracious favour of an establishment for the daughter of his foe, of a man whose name was never mentioned except to cloud his visage? Ah! what was that mystery that connected the haughty house of Coningsby with the humble blood of the Lancashire manufacturer? Why was the portrait of his mother beneath the roof of Millbank? Coningsby had delicately touched upon the subject both with Edith and the Wallingers, but the result of his inquiries only involved the question in deeper gloom. Edith had none but maternal relatives; more than once she had mentioned this, and the Wallingers on other occasions had confirmed the remark. Coningsby had sometimes drawn the conversation to pictures, and he would remind her with playfulness of their first unconscious meeting in the gallery of the Rue Tronchet. Then he remembered that Mr. Millbank was fond of pictures; then he recollected some specimens of Mr. Millbank's collection; and after touching on several which could not excite suspicion, he came to a portrait of a lady. Was it a portrait or an ideal countenance? Edith thought she had heard it was a portrait, but she was by no means certain, and most assuredly was quite unacquainted with the name of the original, if there were an original. Coningsby addressed himself to the point with Sir Joseph. He inquired of the uncle explicitly whether he knew anything on the subject. Sir Joseph was of opinion that it was something that Millbank had somewhere 'picked up.' Millbank used often to 'pick up' pictures. Disappointed in his love, Coningsby sought refuge in the excitement of study, and in the brooding imagination of an aspiring spirit. The softness of his heart seems to have quitted him for ever. He recurred to his habitual reveries of political greatness and public distinction; and as it ever seemed to him that no preparation could be complete for the career which he planned for himself, he devoted himself with increased ardour to that digestion of knowledge which converts it into wisdom. His life at Cambridge was now a life of seclusion. With the exception of a few Eton friends, he avoided all society; and indeed his acquisitions during this term were such as few have equalled, and could only have been mastered by a mental discipline of a severe and exalted character. At the end of the term Coningsby took his degree, and in a few days was about to quit that university, where on the whole he had passed 3 serene and happy years in the society of fond and faithful friends, and in ennobling pursuits. He had many plans for his impending movements, yet none of them very mature ones. Lord Vere wished Coningsby to visit his family in the north, and afterwards to go to Scotland together. Coningsby was more inclined to travel for a year. Amid this hesitation, a circumstance occurred which decided him to adopt neither of these courses. It was commencement, and coming out of the quadrangle of St. John's, Coningsby came suddenly upon Sir Joseph and Lady Wallinger, who were visiting the marvels and rarities of the University. They were alone. Coningsby was a little embarrassed, for he could not forget the abrupt manner in which he had parted from them; but they greeted him with so much cordiality that he instantly recovered himself, and turning, became their companion. He hardly ventured to ask after Edith. At length, in a depressed tone and a hesitating manner, he inquired whether they had lately seen Miss Millbank. He was himself surprised at the extreme light-heartedness which came over him the moment he heard she was in England, at Millbank, with her family. He always very much liked Lady Wallinger, but this morning he hung over her like a lover, lavished on her unceasing and the most delicate attentions, seemed to exist only in the idea of making the Wallingers enjoy and understand Cambridge, and no one else was to be their guide at any place or under any circumstances. He told them exactly what they were to see, how they were to see it, when they were to see it. He told them of things which nobody did see, but which they should. He insisted that Sir Joseph should dine with him in Hall. Sir Joseph could not think of leaving Lady Wallinger. Lady Wallinger could not think of Sir Joseph missing an opportunity that might never offer again. Besides, they might both join her after dinner. Except to give her husband a dinner, Coningsby evidently intended never to leave her side. And the next morning, the occasion favourable, being alone with the lady, Sir Joseph bustling about a carriage, Coningsby said suddenly, with a countenance a little disturbed, and in a low voice, 'I was pleased, I mean surprised, to hear that there was still a Miss Millbank. I thought by this time she might have borne another name?' Lady Wallinger looked at him with an expression of some perplexity, and then said, 'Yes, Edith was much admired, but she need not be precipitate in marrying. Marriage is, for a woman, the event. Edith is too precious to be carelessly bestowed.' 'But I understood,' said Coningsby, 'when I left Paris,' and here he became very confused, 'that Miss Millbank was engaged, on the point of marriage?' 'With whom?' 'Our friend Sidonia.' 'I am sure that Edith would never marry Monsieur de Sidonia, nor Monsieur de Sidonia Edith. 'Tis a preposterous idea,' said Lady Wallinger. 'But he very much admired her?' said Coningsby, with a searching eye. 'Possibly,' said Lady Wallinger, 'but he never even intimated his admiration.' 'But he was very attentive to Miss Millbank?' 'Not more than our intimate friendship authorised, and might expect.' 'You have known Sidonia a long time?' 'It was Monsieur de Sidonia's father who introduced us to the care of Mr. Wallinger,' said Lady Wallinger, 'and therefore I have ever entertained for his son a sincere regard. Besides, I look upon him as a compatriot. Recently he has been even more than usually kind to us, especially to Edith. While we were at Paris he recovered for her a great number of jewels which had been left to her by her uncle in Spain, and, what she prized infinitely more, the whole of her mother's correspondence, which she maintained with this relative since her marriage. Nothing but the influence of Sidonia could have effected this. Therefore, of course, Edith is attached to him almost as much as I am. In short, he is our dearest friend, our counsellor in all our cares. But as for marrying him, the idea is ridiculous to those who know Monsieur Sidonia. No earthly consideration would ever induce him to impair that purity of race on which he prides himself. Besides, there are other obvious objections which would render an alliance between him and my niece utterly impossible. Edith is quite as devoted to her religion as Monsieur Sidonia can be to his race.' A ray of light flashed on the brain of Coningsby as Lady Wallinger said these words. The agitated interview, which never could be explained away, already appeared in quite a different point of view. He became pensive, remained silent, was relieved when Sir Joseph, whose return he had hitherto deprecated, reappeared. Coningsby learnt in the course of the day that the Wallingers were about to make, and immediately, a visit to Hellingsley, their first visit. Indeed, this was the first year that Mr. Millbank had taken up his abode there. He did not much like the change of life, Sir Joseph told Coningsby, but Edith was delighted with Hellingsley, which Sir Joseph understood was a very distinguished place, with fine gardens, of which his niece was particularly fond. When Coningsby returned to his rooms, those rooms which he was soon about to quit for ever, in arranging some papers preparatory to his removal, his eye lighted on a too long unanswered letter of Oswald Millbank. Coningsby had often projected a visit to Oxford, which he much desired to make, but hitherto it had been impossible for him to effect it, except in the absence of Millbank, and he had frequently postponed it that he might combine his first visit to that famous seat of learning with one to his old schoolfellow and friend. Now that was practicable, and immediately Coningsby wrote to apprise Millbank that he had taken his degree, was free, and prepared to pay him immediately the long projected visit. 3 years and more had elapsed since they had quitted Eton. How much had happened in the interval! What new ideas, new feelings, vast and novel knowledge! Though they had not met, they were nevertheless familiar with the progress and improvement of each other's minds. Their suggestive correspondence was too valuable to both of them to have been otherwise than cherished. And now they were to meet on the eve of entering that world for which they had made so sedulous a preparation. Chapter 2. There are few things in life more interesting than an unrestrained interchange of ideas with a congenial spirit, and there are few things more rare. How very seldom do you encounter in the world a man of great abilities, acquirements, experience, who will unmask his mind, unbutton his brains, and pour forth in careless and picturesque phrase all the results of his studies and observation, his knowledge of men, books, and nature. On the contrary, if a man has by any chance what he conceives an original idea, he hoards it as if it were old gold, and rather avoids the subject with which he is most conversant, from fear that you may appropriate his best thoughts. One of the principal causes of our renowned dulness in conversation is our extreme intellectual jealousy. It must be admitted that in this respect authors, but especially poets, bear the palm. They never think they are sufficiently appreciated, and live in tremor lest a brother should distinguish himself. Artists have the repute of being nearly as bad. And as for a small rising politician, a clever speech by a supposed rival or suspected candidate for office destroys his appetite and disturbs his slumbers. One of the chief delights and benefits of travel is, that one is perpetually meeting men of great abilities, of original mind, and rare acquirements, who will converse without reserve. In these discourses the intellect makes daring leaps and marvellous advances. The tone that colours our after life is often caught in these chance colloquies, and the bent given that shapes a career. And yet perhaps there is no occasion when the heart is more open, the brain more quick, the memory more rich and happy, or the tongue more prompt and eloquent, than when two school-day friends, knit by every sympathy of intelligence and affection, meet at the close of their college careers after a long separation, hesitating, as it were, on the verge of active life, and compare together their conclusions of the interval, impart to each other all their thoughts and secret plans and projects, high fancies and noble aspirations, glorious visions of personal fame and national regeneration. Ah, why should such enthusiasm ever die? Life is too short to be little. Man is never so manly as when he feels deeply, acts boldly, and expresses himself with frankness and fervour. Most assuredly there never was a Congress of Friendship wherein more was said and felt than in this meeting, so long projected, and yet perhaps on the whole so happily procrastinated, between Coningsby and Millbank. In a moment they seemed as if they had never parted. Their faithful correspondence, indeed, had maintained the chain of sentiment unbroken. But details are only for conversation. Each poured forth his mind without stint. Not an author that had influenced their taste or judgment but was canvassed and criticised. Not a theory they had framed, or a principle they had adopted, that was not confessed. Often, with boyish glee still lingering with their earnest purpose, they shouted as they discovered that they had formed the same opinion or adopted the same conclusion. They talked all day and late into the night. They condensed into a week the poignant conclusions of 3 years of almost unbroken study. And one night, as they sat together in Millbank's rooms at Oriel, their conversation having for some time taken a political colour, Millbank said, "Now tell me, Coningsby, exactly what you conceive to be the state of parties in this country, for it seems to me that if we penetrate the surface, the classification must be more simple than their many names would intimate." The principle of the exclusive constitution of England having been conceded by the Acts of 1827, 28, and 32, said Coningsby, a party has arisen in the state who demand that the principle of political liberalism shall consequently be carried to its extent, which it appears to them is impossible without getting rid of the fragments of the old constitution that remain. This is the destructive party, a party with distinct and intelligible principles. They seek a specific for the evils of our social system in the general suffrage of the population. They are resisted by another party, who, having given up exclusion, would only embrace as much liberalism as is necessary for the moment, who, without any embarrassing promulgation of principles, wish to keep things as they find them as long as they can, and then will manage them as they find them as well as they can. But as a party must have the semblance of principles, they take the names of the things that they have destroyed. Thus they are devoted to the prerogatives of the Crown, although in truth the Crown has been stripped of every one of its prerogatives. They affect a great veneration for the Constitution in Church and State, though every one knows that the Constitution in Church and State no longer exists. They are ready to stand or fall with the independence of the Upper House of Parliament, though in practice they are perfectly aware that with their sanction the Upper House has abdicated its initiatory functions, and now serves only as a court of review of the legislation of the House of Commons. Whenever public opinion, which this party never attempts to form, to educate, or to lead, falls into some violent perplexity, passion, or caprice, this party yields without a struggle to the impulse, and when the storm has passed, attempts to obstruct and obviate the logical and ultimately the inevitable results of the very measures they have themselves originated or to which they have consented. This is the Conservative party. I care not whether men are called Whigs or Tories, Radicals or Chartists, or by what nickname a bustling and thoughtless race may designate themselves, but these two divisions comprehend at present the English nation. With regard to the first school, I, for one, have no faith in the remedial qualities of a government carried on by a neglected democracy, who, for 3 centuries, have received no education. What prospect does it offer us of those high principles of conduct with which we have fed our imaginations and strengthened our will? I perceive none of the elements of government that should secure the happiness of a people and the greatness of a realm. But in my opinion, if democracy be combated only by conservatism, democracy must triumph, and at no distant date. This then is our position. The man who enters public life at this epoch has to choose between political infidelity and a destructive creed. This then, said Millbank, is the dilemma to which we are brought by nearly 2 centuries of parliamentary monarchy and parliamentary church. 'Tis true, said Coningsby, we cannot conceal it from ourselves that the first has made government detested, and the second religion disbelieved. Many men in this country, said Millbank, and especially in the class to which I belong, are reconciled to the contemplation of democracy, because they have accustomed themselves to believe that it is the only power by which we can sweep away those sectional privileges and interests that impede the intelligence and industry of the community. And yet, said Coningsby, the only way to terminate what, in the language of the present day, is called class legislation, is not to entrust power to classes. You would find a locofoco majority as much addicted to class legislation as a factitious aristocracy. The only power that has no class sympathy is the sovereign. But suppose the case of an arbitrary sovereign, what would be your check against him? The same as against an arbitrary parliament. But a parliament is responsible. To whom? To their constituent body. Suppose it was to vote itself perpetual. But public opinion would prevent that. And is public opinion of less influence on an individual than on a body? But public opinion may be indifferent. A nation may be misled, may be corrupt. If the nation that elects the Parliament be corrupt, the elected body will resemble it. The nation that is corrupt deserves to fall. But this only shows that there is something to be considered beyond forms of government, national character. And herein mainly should we repose our hopes. If a nation be led to aim at the good and the great, depend upon it, whatever be its form, the government will respond to its convictions and its sentiments. Do you then declare against parliamentary government? Far from it. I look upon political change as the greatest of evils, for it comprehends all. But if we have no faith in the permanence of the existing settlement, if the very individuals who established it are, year after year, proposing their modifications or their reconstructions, so also, while we uphold what exists, ought we to prepare ourselves for the change we deem impending? Now, I would not that either ourselves or our fellow citizens should be taken unawares, as in 1832, when the very men who opposed the Reform Bill offered contrary objections to it which destroyed each other, so ignorant were they of its real character, its historical causes, its political consequences. We should now so act that, when the occasions arrive, we should clearly comprehend what we want, and have formed an opinion as to the best means by which that want can be supplied. Now, I would not that either ourselves or our fellow citizens should be taken unawares, as in 1832, when the very men who opposed the Reform Bill offered contrary objections to it which destroyed each other, so ignorant were they of its real character, its historical causes, its political consequences. We should now so act that, when the occasions arrive, we should clearly comprehend what we want, and have formed an opinion as to the best means by which that want can be supplied. For this purpose I would accustom the public mind to the contemplation of an existing though torpid power in the Constitution, capable of removing our social grievances, were we to transfer to it those prerogatives which the Parliament has gradually usurped, and used in a manner which has produced the present material and moral disorganisation. The House of Commons is the house of a few. The sovereign is the sovereign of all. The proper leader of the people is the individual who sits upon the throne. Then you abjure the representative principle? Why so? Representation is not necessarily, or even in a principal sense, parliamentary. Parliament is not sitting at this moment, and yet the nation is represented in its highest as well as in its most minute interests. Not a grievance escapes notice and redress. I see in the newspaper this morning that a pedagogue has brutally chastised his pupil. It is a fact known over all England. We must not forget that a principle of government is reserved for our days that we shall not find in our Aristotles, or even in the forests of Tacitus, nor in our Saxon Wittenagemotes, nor in our Plantagenet parliaments. Opinion is now supreme, and opinion speaks in print. The representation of the press is far more complete than the representation of Parliament. Parliamentary representation was the happy device of a ruder age, to which it was admirably adapted, an age of semi-civilization, when there was a leading class in the community, but it exhibits many symptoms of desuetude. It is controlled by a system of representation more vigorous and comprehensive, which absorbs its duties and fulfils them more efficiently, and in which discussion is pursued on fairer terms, and often with more depth and information. And to what power would you entrust the function of taxation? To some power that would employ it more discreetly than in creating our present amount of debt and in establishing our present system of imposts. In a word, true wisdom lies in the policy that would effect its ends by the influence of opinion, and yet by the means of existing forms. Nevertheless, if we are forced to revolutions, let us propose to our consideration the idea of a free monarchy, established on fundamental laws, itself the apex of a vast pile of municipal and local government, ruling an educated people, represented by a free and intellectual press. Before such a royal authority, supported by such a national opinion, the sectional anomalies of our country would disappear. Under such a system, where qualification would not be parliamentary but personal, even statesmen would be educated. We should have no more diplomatists who could not speak French, no more bishops ignorant of theology, no more generals in chief who never saw a field. Now there is a polity adapted to our laws, our institutions, our feelings, our manners, our traditions. A polity capable of great ends and appealing to high sentiments. A polity which in my opinion would render government an object of national affection, which would terminate sectional anomalies, assuage religious hearts, and extinguish Chartism. 'You said to me yesterday,' said Millbank after a pause, quoting the words of another which you adopted, 'that man was made to adore and to obey. Now you have shown me the means by which you deem it possible that government might become no longer odious to the subject. You have shown how man may be induced to obey. But there are duties and interests for man beyond political obedience, and social comfort and national greatness, higher interests and greater duties. How would you deal with their spiritual necessities? You think you can combat political infidelity in a nation by the principle of enlightened loyalty? How would you encounter religious infidelity in a state? By what means is the principle of profound reverence to be revived? How, in short, is man to be led to adore?' 'Ah, that is a subject which I have not forgotten,' replied Coningsby. 'I know from your letters how deeply it has engaged your thoughts. I confess to you that it has often filled mine with perplexity and depression. When we were at Eton, and both of us impregnated with the contrary prejudices in which we had been brought up, there was still between us one common ground of sympathy and trust. We reposed with confidence and affection in the bosom of our Church. Time and thought, with both of us, have only matured the spontaneous veneration of our boyhood. But time and thought have also shown me that the Church of our heart is not in a position, as regards the community, consonant with its original and essential character, or with the welfare of the nation.' 'The character of a Church is universality,' replied Millbank. 'Once the Church in this country was universal in principle and practice. When, wedded to the State, it continued at least universal in principle, if not in practice. What is it now? All ties between the State and the Church are abolished, except those which tend to its danger and degradation.' 'What can be more anomalous than the present connection between State and Church? Every condition on which it was originally consented to has been cancelled. That original alliance was, in my view, an equal calamity for the nation and the Church; but at least it was an intelligible compact. Parliament, then consisting only of members of the Established Church, was, on ecclesiastical matters, a lay synod, and might, in some points of view, be esteemed a necessary portion of Church government. But you have effaced this exclusive character of Parliament. You have determined that a communion with the Established Church shall no longer be part of the qualification for sitting in the House of Commons. There is no reason, so far as the Constitution avails, why every member of the House of Commons should not be a dissenter. But the whole power of the country is concentrated in the House of Commons. The House of Lords, even the monarch himself, has openly announced and confessed, within these 10 years, that the will of the House of Commons is supreme. A single vote of the House of Commons in 1832 made the Duke of Wellington declare, in the House of Lords, that he was obliged to abandon his sovereign in the most difficult and distressing circumstances. The House of Commons is absolute. It is the State. L'État c'est moi. The House of Commons virtually appoints the bishops. A sectarian assembly appoints the bishops of the Established Church. They may appoint 20 Hoadleys. James II was expelled the throne because he appointed a Roman Catholic to an Anglican see. A Parliament might do this to morrow with impunity. And this is the constitution in Church and State which Conservative dinners toast. The only consequences of the present union of Church and State are, that on the side of the State there is perpetual interference in ecclesiastical government, and, on the side of the Church, a sedulous avoidance of all those principles on which alone Church government can be established, and by the influence of which alone can the Church of England again become universal. But it is urged that the state protects its revenues. No ecclesiastical revenues should be safe that require protection. Modern history is a history of church spoliation. And by whom? Not by the people, not by the democracy. No, it is the emperor, the king, the feudal baron, the court minion. The estate of the church is the estate of the people, so long as the church is governed on its real principles. The church is the medium by which the despised and degraded classes assert the native equality of man and vindicate the rights and power of intellect. It made, in the darkest hour of Norman rule, the son of a Saxon pedlar primate of England, and placed Nicholas Breakspear, a Hertfordshire peasant, on the throne of the Caesars. It would do as great things now if it were divorced from the degrading and tyrannical connection that enchains it. You would have other sons of peasants bishops of England, instead of men appointed to that sacred office solely because they were the needy scions of a factitious aristocracy, men of gross ignorance, profligate habits, and grinding extortion, who have disgraced the episcopal throne and profaned the altar. But surely you cannot justly extend such a description to the present bench? Surely not. I speak of the past that has produced so much present evil. We live in decent times, frigid, latitudinarian, alarmed, decorous. A priest is scarcely deemed in our days a fit successor to the authors of the Gospels, if he be not the editor of a Greek play; and he who follows St. Paul must now at least have been private tutor of some young nobleman who has taken a good degree. And then you are all astonished that the Church is not universal. Why? Nothing but the indestructibleness of its principles, however feebly pursued, could have maintained even the disorganised body that still survives. And yet, my dear Coningsby, with all its past errors and all its present deficiencies, it is by the Church, I would have said until I listened to you to night, by the Church alone that I see any chance of regenerating the national character. The parochial system, though shaken by the fatal Poor Law, is still the most ancient, the most comprehensive, and the most popular institution of the country. The younger priests are, in general, men whose souls are awake to the high mission which they have to fulfil, and which their predecessors so neglected. There is, I think, a rising feeling in the community that parliamentary intercourse in matters ecclesiastical has not tended either to the spiritual or the material elevation of the humbler orders. Divorce the Church from the State, and the spiritual power that struggled against the brute force of the Dark Ages, against tyrannical monarchs and barbarous barons, will struggle again in opposition to influences of a different form, but of a similar tendency, equally selfish, equally insensible, equally barbarizing. The priests of God are the tribunes of the people. O ignorant, that with such a mission they should ever have cringed in the antechambers of ministers, or bowed before parliamentary committees. The utilitarian system is dead, said Coningsby. It has passed through the heaven of philosophy like a hailstorm, cold, noisy, sharp, and peppering, and it has melted away. And yet can we wonder that it found some success when we consider the political ignorance and social torpor which it assailed? Anointed kings turned into chief magistrates, and therefore much overpaid. Estates of the realm changed into parliaments of virtual representation, and therefore requiring real reform. Holy Church transformed into national establishment, and therefore grumbled at by all the nation for whom it was not supported. What an inevitable harvest of sedition, radicalism, and infidelity! I really think there is no society, however great its resources, that could long resist the united influences of chief magistrate, virtual representation, and church establishment. I have immense faith in the new generation, said Millbank eagerly. It is a holy thing to see a state saved by its youth, said Coningsby. And then he added in a tone of humility, if not of depression, But what a task! What a variety of qualities, what a combination of circumstances is requisite! What bright abilities and what noble patience! What confidence from the people, what favour from the Most High! 'But He will favour us,' said Millbank. 'And I say to you, as Nathan said unto David, Thou art the man. You were our leader at Eton. The friends of your heart and boyhood still cling and cluster round you. They are all men whose position forces them into public life. It is a nucleus of honour, faith, and power. You have only to dare. And will you not dare? It is our privilege to live in an age when the career of the highest ambition is identified with the performance of the greatest good. Of the present epoch it may be truly said, who dares to be good, dares to be great.' 'Heaven is above all,' said Coningsby. 'The curtain of our fate is still undrawn. We are happy in our friends, dear Millbank, and whatever lights, we will stand together. For myself, I prefer fame to life, and yet the consciousness of heroic deeds to the most widespread celebrity.' CHAPTER III.